Walter Dawson grabbed Clara by the arm and shoved her through the front door. She hit the porch hard, her knees cracking against frozen wood, her 5-year-old daughter screaming in her arms. "Walter, please, she has a fever." The door slammed shut, the bolt locked. Clara pounded on it until her fists bled, but nobody came. Behind that door stood her dead husband's family. In front of her, nothing but a blizzard and 20 miles of empty wilderness. She had no horse, no food, no coat, and her little girl was dying. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to my channel and follow Clara's journey to the very end. Comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. Now, let's begin. Montana Territory, winter of 1873. Clara Dawson had begged. She wasn't proud of it, but she'd done it. Got down on her knees, right there on the kitchen floor of the Dawson farmhouse. Her daughter Emma clutched to a chest, and begged her brother-in-law to let them stay. Walter hadn't even looked at her. He'd stood by the window, arms folded, jaw set, staring out at the snow like it was more interesting than a woman pleading for her child's life. "Get up, Clara," he'd said. "She's burning up, Walter. Feel her. Just feel her forehead and tell me you can throw a sick child out into—" "I said, get up." Clara had risen slowly. Her legs had trembled beneath her, but she'd locked her knees and straightened her spine, because Samuel had always said she was the strongest woman he'd ever known, and she would not prove her dead husband wrong. Not here. Not in front of this man. "One more week," Clara had said. "That's all I'm asking. 1 week until the fever breaks and the roads clear. Then we'll go. You'll never see us again." Walter had turned from the window. His eyes had moved over her the way a man looks at a broken fence. Something that needed removing, not fixing. "You've been saying 1 more week for 2 months now. Because your brother's body wasn't even cold before you started counting the days." Walter's face had hardened. "Watch your mouth." "Or what?" Clara had stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You'll throw me out? You're already doing that." Edna had been standing near the stove through all of it, silent, gripping a dish rag so hard her knuckles had gone white. Clara had turned to her. "Edna, you held Emma the day she was born. You sang to her. You called her your niece." Edna's chin had trembled. She'd opened her mouth, then closed it. "Edna, please, look at me." Edna had looked. Her eyes had been wet, and for 1 second, 1 single second, Clara had thought maybe there was still something human left in this house. Then Walter had spoken. "Edna, go upstairs." Edna had flinched. She'd looked at Clara one more time, and something had passed between them, an apology that would never be spoken. Then she'd set down the dish rag and walked out of the room. Her footsteps on the stairs had sounded like a door closing. Clara had felt it then, the last thread of hope snapping clean. "You're a coward, Walter," she'd said quietly, "hiding behind your dead brother's name to steal his land." Walter had moved fast. He'd crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, grabbed Clara's arm, and yanked her toward the front door. Emma had screamed. Clara had twisted, pulling back, but Walter was bigger and stronger, and he didn't care. "Let go of me! You want to run your mouth?" Walter had jerked the door open. Cold air had flooded in. "Run it out there." "Walter, stop! She's sick! At least give us a blanket, for God's sake!" He'd shoved her through the doorway. Clara had stumbled, caught herself on the porch railing, clutching Emma so tight the child had cried out. Walter had stood in the doorframe, his breath steaming in the cold. "Samuel would be sick looking at you," Clara had spat. Something had flickered in Walter's face. Guilt, maybe. Or just anger that she'd found the nerve to say it. He'd reached for the door. "Walter," Clara's voice had cracked. She'd hated herself for it. "At least let me take her coat. Emma's coat. It's hanging right there on the hook. You can see it from where you're standing. Just her coat. That's all." Walter had paused. His hand had rested on the door. For 3 seconds he'd stood there, and Clara had held her breath. Then he'd shut the door. The bolt had slid home. Clara had stood on that porch with blood on her knuckles from pounding, and a child who was burning alive with fever, and she had not cried. She had wanted to. God, she had wanted to. But if she started, she might not stop, and stopping was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Mama?" Emma's voice had been small, confused. "Why did Uncle Walter push us?" Clara had swallowed everything inside her, the rage, the fear, the grief, and shoved it down so deep she could almost pretend it wasn't there. "We're going for a walk, baby." "It's cold, Mama." "I know, but I'll keep you warm. You trust Mama?" Emma had nodded against her chest. "I trust you, Mama." Clara had stepped off that porch and walked straight into the storm. That had been 6 hours ago. Now her legs were failing. She could feel it, the way her knees buckled with every step, the way her body swayed like a drunk. Emma had stopped talking an hour ago, stopped shivering 30 minutes after that. And Clara knew enough about cold to know that when a body stops shivering, it's not because the cold is gone. It's because the body has given up fighting it. "Emma?" Clara shook her gently. "Emma, talk to Mama." Nothing. "Emma Rose Dawson, you open your eyes right now." Emma's eyelids fluttered. "Tired, Mama." "I know you're tired, but you don't get to sleep yet. You hear me? Tell me a story. Tell me about your rabbit, the one Papa carved you." "Lost it," Emma mumbled. "Left it at Uncle Walter's." Clara's jaw tightened. Another thing taken from them. "Then I'll find you a new one. Something even better. But you gotta stay awake for me. Deal?" "Deal," Emma whispered, but her eyes were already closing. Clara pressed on. One foot, then the other. The wind drove snow into her face like needles, and she couldn't feel her hands anymore, couldn't feel anything below her elbows. And somewhere in the rational part of her mind, she understood that she was dying. Not might die, was dying. Right now, with every step. And then she heard it. A growl. Low. Close. Clara stopped. Her heart slammed so hard she felt it in her throat. 3 wolves, spread out in the half-circle, cutting off the path ahead. Thin, starving, the kind of hungry that makes an animal lose its fear of humans. The lead wolf locked eyes with her. Clara reached for the knife at her belt. Samuel's knife. The blade was dull, and the handle was cracked, and it wouldn't stop a single wolf, let alone 3. "Mama?" Emma stirred. She must have felt Clara's heartbeat change because her eyes opened. She saw the wolves and went rigid. "Mama." "Don't look at them, baby. Look at me." "Mama, I'm scared." "I know. Close your eyes." "But—" "Close your eyes, Emma." Emma buried her face in Clara's neck. Clara could feel her daughter's tears, hot against her frozen skin. The lead wolf stepped forward. Then another step. Its body was coiled low, ready. Clara raised the knife. Her hand was shaking so badly the blade caught the dim light and threw it wild. "Come on, then," she said through her teeth. "Come on." The wolf lunged. A rifle shot cracked through the valley like thunder. The wolf twisted in midair and hit the snow 3 feet from Clara's boots. Dead before it landed. The other 2 scattered, gone in seconds, swallowed by the storm. Clara's knees gave out. She hit the ground hard, twisting to keep Emma on top of her, away from the snow. Her breath came in broken gasps, and her whole body shook, and she couldn't think, couldn't move. couldn't do anything but hold her child and wait for whatever came next. Footsteps, steady and heavy, crunching through the crust of ice. A voice, low, rough, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who hadn't used it much in a long time. "Can you stand?" Clara looked up. A man stood over her, rifle in one hand, the other extended toward her. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that had seen more winters than most people. Snow clung to the brim of his hat, and beneath it his face was hard, weathered, unreadable. A scar curved along his left shoulder where his collar had shifted. Beside him stood a dog, old, gray around the muzzle, watching Clara with calm brown eyes.
"My daughter," Clara said. "She needs help. She's got a fever, and she hasn't eaten, and I don't—" She couldn't finish. The words jammed up in her throat like a fist. The man knelt. He pressed the back of his hand against Emma's forehead. His jaw tightened. "How long?" "Since yesterday morning." He nodded once. Then he did something Clara didn't expect. He shrugged off his own coat, the only thing between him and the storm, and wrapped it around Emma. He lifted the child from Clara's arms with a gentleness that didn't match his size, cradling her against his chest like he'd done this before. Like his body remembered something his face wouldn't show. "My cabin's a quarter-mile north," he said. "Can you walk that far?" Clara forced herself to her feet. "I can walk." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not pity, not judgment. Recognition. "Then stay behind me. Step where I step." He turned and walked. Clara followed. The dog fell in beside her, pressing its warm body against her leg, guiding her through the white. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Not yet. The cabin appeared through the storm like something imagined. Small. Solid. Smoke curling from the chimney into the wind. The man pushed through the door, and the warmth inside hit Clara so hard her vision blurred. He moved fast, set Emma on the cot nearest the fire, pulled blankets over her, poured water into a pot and put it on the stove. Reached for a cloth, soaked it, wrung it out, pressed it to Emma's forehead. Clara stood in the doorway, shaking. Not from cold anymore, from something else. Something she couldn't name. "Shut the door," the man said without turning around. "You're letting the heat out." Clara shut the door. She leaned against it, watching him work. His hands moved with a sureness that told her this wasn't the first time he'd fought a child's fever. "You know what you're doing," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer right away. He adjusted the cloth on Emma's forehead, pulled the blanket higher around the child's chin. Then, still not looking at Clara, he said, "I used to." Clara waited for more. None came. The dog, Scout, she'd learn later, padded to the cot and lay down beside it. He rested his chin near Emma's hand. The child's fingers twitched, brushing against his fur, and for the first time in hours, her face softened. "She needs food," the man said. "But not yet. Water first. Small sips. If the fever don't break by morning—" He stopped. "If it doesn't break by morning, what?" He looked at her then, full on. His eyes were dark, carrying something so heavy, Clara felt it in her own chest. "Let's get to morning first," he said. Clara crossed the room and sank into the chair beside the cot. She reached for Emma's hand. It was small and hot and limp in her own. "What's your name?" Clara asked. "Elijah Cole." "I'm Clara. This is Emma." Elijah nodded. He moved to the stove and ladled broth into a bowl, brought it to Clara and set it on the table beside her. "Drink it slow." Clara wrapped her hands around the bowl. The heat stung her frozen fingers, but she held on. She took a sip, then another.
The warmth spread through her chest and into her stomach, and she realized she was crying. Not sobbing, just tears sliding down her face without permission. Elijah didn't acknowledge it. He sat down across the room, picked up a piece of wood and a knife, and began carving. Giving her the one thing nobody had given her in months: privacy to fall apart. Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at her daughter, at the dog pressed against Emma's side, at this stranger who had pulled them from the teeth of a storm and was now sitting quietly in his chair, asking nothing, demanding nothing. "Elijah," she said. He glanced up. "Why were you out there? In the storm. Nobody goes out in a storm like that." Elijah was quiet for a long moment. His knife paused against the wood. Then he said, "I heard the wolves." "You went out because of wolves?" "Wolves don't howl like that unless they've cornered something." He looked at her. "Or someone." Clara held his gaze. "You could have died out there." Elijah turned back to his carving. "Could have," he said. "Didn't." Clara almost smiled. Almost. It was the closest thing to humor she'd felt in months. She looked back at Emma. The child's breathing had steadied, but the fever still burned. Scout hadn't moved. His big brown eyes watched the girl's face like a sentry keeping guard. "Your dog," Clara said softly. "He won't leave her side." Elijah's hands stilled on the wood, just for a second. Then he resumed carving. "He remembers," Elijah said quietly. "He's old, but he remembers." Clara heard it again, that weight beneath the words. A door that was shut tight, but not locked. She could hear what was behind it, the shape of it, the size of it, but she didn't push. Not tonight. Instead, she pulled her chair closer to the cot. She laid her hand on Emma's chest, feeling the rise and fall of her daughter's breathing. She closed her eyes. "Elijah?" "Yeah?" "Thank you." He didn't answer, but she heard the knife pause against the wood, just for a breath. And that pause said more than any words could. The fire cracked. The wind pressed against the walls. Scout exhaled, a long, slow breath, and settled deeper against Emma's side. And Clara Dawson, who had been thrown out like nothing by people who should have loved her, sat in a stranger's cabin and listened to her daughter breathe and thought, "We're alive. We made it through the night. And whatever comes tomorrow, we made it through tonight." Then Emma's hand moved. Slowly, weakly, her small fingers found Scout's ear. She curled them around it and held on. And in her sleep she whispered, "Good dog." Elijah's knife stopped. He looked at the child. He looked at the old dog who hadn't left a sick little girl's side. And something crossed his face that he turned away too fast for Clara to read. But she'd seen it. Just a flash, just a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just sat there in the warmth of a stranger's home, holding her daughter's hand, listening to the fire, and wondering what kind of man walks into a blizzard to save someone he's never met. And what kind of pain teaches a man to do that? The fever didn't break by morning. Clara knew it before she opened her eyes. She could feel it in the heat radiating from Emma's small body, in the restless way the child shifted beneath the blankets, in the soft whimpers that slipped from her lips like prayers that couldn't find their way to words. Clara sat up. Her body ached in ways she didn't think were possible. Every muscle, every joint, every inch of skin that had been exposed to the storm screamed at her. But she pushed through it. Pain was a luxury for people who had time to feel it. "How is she?" Elijah's voice came from across the room. He was already awake, sitting by the stove, a cup of coffee in his hand. Clara wondered if he'd slept at all. "Worse," Clara said. She pressed her hand to Emma's forehead and flinched. "She's hotter than last night." Elijah set down the cup and crossed the room. He knelt beside the cot and placed his hand against Emma's neck, then her chest. His jaw tightened. Clara watched his face and felt something cold thread through her gut. "Tell me," she said. "Fever's climbing." "I know that. What do we do?" Elijah stood. He moved to the shelf and pulled down a jar filled with dried leaves. "Willow bark tea. It'll help bring it down. But she needs to drink it. All of it." "She can barely swallow." "Then we make her." He said it plainly, without cruelty, like a man who had stood in this exact place before and knew that kindness sometimes meant forcing a sick child to do something they didn't want to. Clara watched him prepare the tea. His hands were steady, practiced. She thought about the way he'd said, "I used to," the night before. The way Scout had settled beside Emma, like he was guarding something precious. The way this cabin had a shelf full of remedies that a man living alone wouldn't need. "You've done this before," Clara said quietly. Elijah poured hot water over the bark. He didn't look at her. "Yeah." "For who?" The question hung in the air. Elijah's hands paused for just a moment, then resumed. "My son." Clara felt her breath catch. "You have a son?" "Had." The word was flat, final, like a door pulled shut from the inside. "His name was Daniel." Clara waited. She didn't push. She'd learned a long time ago that pushing a man into his pain only made him run further from it. Elijah brought the tea to the cot. He lifted Emma's head gently, so gently, and pressed the cup to her lips. "Come on now," he murmured. "Just a little." Emma whimpered. Her face scrunched up and she turned away. "I know it tastes bad," Elijah said. His voice was different now, softer, like something had unlocked in him without his permission. "But you gotta be tough for me. Can you do that?" Emma's eyes opened, barely. She looked at Elijah through a haze of fever, and for a moment Clara thought she'd refuse. Then Emma opened her mouth. She took a sip, coughed, took another. "Good girl," Elijah whispered. "That's real good." Clara's throat tightened so hard she had to look away, because the way Elijah held her daughter's head, the way his thumb brushed the hair from Emma's forehead, the way his voice broke on the word good, that wasn't a stranger tending to a sick child. That was a father whose hands remembered what his heart had tried to forget. Elijah laid Emma back down. He pulled the blanket up to her chin and stood. When he turned to Clara, his face was composed again. The door was shut. "She needs to drink that every 2 hours," he said. "I'll make more." Elijah. "I'll check the woodpile. Storm took a lot out of it last night, and if another one hits—" "Elijah." He stopped. He stood there with his back half turned, his hand gripping the edge of the shelf, and Clara could see the tension running through his shoulders like a wire pulled too tight. "Thank you," she said, "for what you just did." He nodded once, short and sharp. Then he grabbed his coat and walked out the door. Scout lifted his head and watched him go. Then the old dog looked at Clara, looked at Emma, and laid back down. Clara let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like hours. She looked at her daughter, at the color that was too high in her cheeks, at the way her small body shook even under 3 blankets. "You're gonna be okay, baby," Clara whispered. "You hear me? You're gonna be okay." She wasn't sure if she was talking to Emma or herself. The next 3 hours were the longest of Clara's life. She sat beside the cot, feeding Emma sips of willow bark tea every time the child stirred. Each time was a battle. Emma cried. She pushed the cup away. She called for her papa, and that nearly broke Clara in half. But she kept going, because that's what mothers do. Elijah came and went. He brought in wood. He stoked the fire. He refilled the water pot without being asked. He moved through the cabin with a quiet efficiency that Clara was beginning to understand wasn't coldness. It was discipline. The discipline of a man who had learned to keep himself useful, because being useful was the only thing standing between him and the grief that would swallow him whole if he ever sat still long enough. Around midday, Emma's fever spiked. The child's whole body went rigid, her back arching, her tiny hands clenching the blanket. Clara grabbed her, held her, felt the heat pouring off her daughter like a stove. "Elijah!" Clara's voice came out raw, desperate. "Something's wrong. She's burning up. Elijah!" He was beside her in 3 strides. He pressed his hand to Emma's forehead and pulled it back fast. "We need to cool her down, now." "How?" "Snow. Pack it in cloths, not against her skin, around her. We bring the fever down slow, or it'll—" He stopped himself. "Or it'll what?" He looked at her. "Just help me." They worked together. Elijah packed snow into strips of cloth, while Clara held Emma steady, murmuring to her, telling her stories about rabbits and sunshine and the garden they'd grow in the spring. She didn't know where the words came from. They just poured out, desperate and wild, anything to fill the silence that scared her more than any storm. "Mama," Emma whispered. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. "I see Papa." Clara's heart stopped. "No, baby, no. You look at me. You look right at me." "He's standing right there, Mama. He's smiling." Clara grabbed Emma's face in both hands. "Emma Rose Dawson, your papa is not here. I am here. Mama is right here. And you are not going anywhere. Do you understand me?" Emma blinked, her eyes focused, just barely, on Clara's face. "There you are," Clara breathed. "There's my girl. You stay with me." Elijah hadn't moved. He knelt on the other side of the cot, a snow-packed cloth in his hands, and Clara saw something on his face she hadn't seen before. Fear. Real, gut-deep fear. Not for himself. For this child. This child he'd known for less than a day. "Put it here," Clara said, pointing to Emma's sides. "And here." Elijah placed the cloths carefully, adjusting them with hands that trembled just slightly. Clara noticed. She didn't say anything. They sat there together, watching, waiting. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the cabin walls. Scout whined softly, his nose pressed against Emma's ankle. An hour passed, then 2. Somewhere near the 3rd hour, Emma's breathing changed. It slowed, deepened. The rigid tension in her small body began to release, muscle by muscle, like a fist unclenching. Clara pressed her hand to her daughter's forehead. She almost collapsed. "It's dropping," Clara said. "Elijah, it's dropping." Elijah leaned forward. He placed his hand where Clara's had been. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something in his face had shifted. Not joy, not relief, something quieter than that. "Yeah," he said. "It's dropping." Clara let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She pulled Emma against her chest and held her, rocking her gently, pressing her lips to her daughter's damp hair. "You did it, baby. You fought it off. You're so strong." Emma's small hand found Clara's collar. She held on. Elijah stood. He walked to the far side of the cabin and sat down heavily in his chair. He rested his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor. Clara watched him from across the room and saw it. The way his shoulders shook, just once. The way he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Then it was gone. He straightened, reached for his knife and the block of wood, and started carving. Clara didn't speak. She understood. She understood because she'd done the same thing 100 times. Pushed the feeling down, picked up whatever task was nearest, and kept moving. It was what people like them did. People who had lost too much to afford the luxury of breaking down. That evening, Emma woke up. Really woke up. Not the feverish, half-conscious stirring of the past day, but eyes open, looking around, present. "Mama?" Clara nearly knocked over the bowl of broth she'd been holding. "I'm here, baby. Right here." Emma looked around the cabin. Her eyes moved from the fire to the walls to the shelf of jars to Scout, who had lifted his head at the sound of her voice. "Doggy," Emma said. Clara laughed. It came out broken and wet, and she didn't care. "That's Scout." Emma looked at the dog. Scout looked at Emma. The dog's tail moved, just once, a slow wag. "Can I pet him?" Emma asked. "I think he'd like that very much." Emma reached out her small hand. Scout stretched his neck forward and pressed his nose against her palm. Emma giggled. The sound was so light, so pure, that Clara had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from crying again. Elijah was sitting in his chair. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but Clara could see him watching. His knife was still. The wood sat untouched in his lap. Emma noticed him. She pulled her hand back from Scout and pressed herself closer to Clara. "Who's that?" she whispered. "That's Elijah. He helped us. He saved us, sweetheart." Emma studied him from behind Clara's arm. Elijah didn't move. He sat perfectly still, the way a man sits when he knows he's being measured by something small and scared and more honest than any adult in the room. "He's big," Emma whispered. Clara almost smiled. "He is. Is he nice?" Elijah glanced at Clara. She saw the faintest crack at the corner of his mouth. He looked back at Emma and said, "I try to be." Emma considered this. She looked at Scout. She looked at Elijah. Then she said, "Your dog is nice." "He thinks so too," Elijah said. Emma didn't laugh, but something in her face loosened. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Just cautious. And cautious, Clara knew, was something that could be worked with. "You hungry?" Elijah asked. Emma nodded, slowly. Elijah stood and moved to the stove. He ladled broth into a small bowl, less than he'd given Clara, carefully measured, and brought it to the cot. He held it out to Emma, but didn't step too close. Emma looked at Clara. Clara nodded. Emma took the bowl in both hands. She sipped, then sipped again. Then she looked up at Elijah and said, "It's warm." "That's the idea," Elijah said. Emma went back to her broth. Elijah returned to his chair, but something had changed. The distance between them had narrowed. Not much, just a fraction, but Clara felt it like a shift in the air before a thaw. Later that night, after Emma had fallen back asleep with Scout curled against her side, Clara sat across from Elijah at the small table. The fire had burned down to a steady glow. The cabin was warm. Too warm, almost, after so many days of cold. Clara held a cup of coffee between her hands. Elijah held one of his own. Neither had spoken for a while, but it wasn't the awkward silence of strangers. It was something else. The comfortable quiet of two people who had just fought something together, and won. "She's gonna make it," Clara said softly. "She's tough," Elijah said. "Takes after her mama." Clara looked at him. "How would you know what her mama's like?" "I watched you carry a sick child through a blizzard with no coat, no food, and no plan. Fight off a wolf pack with a kitchen knife, then sit up all night forcing tea down her throat when she fought you every sip." He took a drink of his coffee. "I got a pretty fair idea." Clara felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the fire. She looked down at her cup.
I wasn't brave, she said. I was terrified the whole time.
That's what brave is. Clara looked up. Elijah was watching her. Not the way Walter had watched her, assessing, calculating. Elijah watched her the way someone watches a fire, with attention, with respect for what it could do.
Can I ask you something? Clara said.
You can ask.
Your son, Daniel. She said the name carefully, like handling something fragile. How old was he?
Elijah's hand tightened around his cup. For a long time, the only sound was the fire and the wind and Emma's breathing. 3, he said. He was 3 years old.
And your wife?
Ruth. He said her name like it cost him something. We got married when I was 22. She was 20.
Prettiest girl in Billings, and too smart to marry a man like me. But she did it anyway.
Clara waited. Elijah stared into his coffee. I went to fight. The war. Left her and Daniel on the homestead because I thought... I don't know what I thought. That I was doing the right thing. That I'd come back, and everything would be the same. He exhaled. Diphtheria came through while I was gone. Hit the whole valley. Ruth tried to ride to town for medicine, but the snow was too deep. She made it back to the cabin, but by then... His voice caught. He cleared his throat. Daniel went first. Ruth lasted 2 more days. Clara set down her cup. Her hands were shaking. I came home to 2 graves, Elijah said. My neighbor, Hattie Brennan, had buried them. She'd found them when she came to check on Ruth. He paused. Scout was lying between the graves when I rode up. Wouldn't leave. Took me 3 days to get him to come inside. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth. She thought about Emma, about how close she had come to being another small grave in another frozen valley. And she thought about this man sitting across from her who had already lived through the thing she feared most.
Elijah, she said, I'm so sorry.
He nodded, not dismissively, just accepting. Like a man who had heard those words so many times they had worn smooth, but who still appreciated the intent behind them. 4 years ago, he said. Some days it feels like 40. Some days it feels like this morning. Clara understood that. She understood it in her bones.
That's why you live out here, she said. Alone.
Wasn't planning on being alone forever, Elijah said quietly. Just didn't see a reason to be around people. He looked at Scout, sleeping beside Emma. He's the only one who stayed. Clara followed his gaze to the old dog, to her daughter's small hand still resting on Scout's ear, even in sleep, to the way the firelight played across both of them, the child and the dog, like they'd known each other for years instead of hours.
He remembers,
Clara said, echoing Elijah's words from the night before. Elijah looked at her. Yeah, he said. He does. They sat there in the quiet. The fire settled. The wind outside had gentled, and the cabin felt smaller than it was, in the way that safe places do when the world outside is too big and too cold and too cruel. Clara finished her coffee. She set the cup down and stood. She should sleep. Emma would need her in the morning, and there was no telling what tomorrow would bring. She stopped beside the cot, looked down at her daughter, looked at Scout. Then she turned back to Elijah.
Elijah.
Yeah?
You walked into a blizzard last night. You gave up your coat. You fought my daughter's fever like she was your own. And you haven't asked me for a single thing.
Clara paused.
Why?
Elijah was quiet for a long moment.
He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands.
Then he said, Because 4 years ago, nobody came for mine. Clara felt the words hit her chest like a stone. She stood there, looking at this man who had lost everything and still walked into a storm to save a stranger's child. And she thought, that is either the saddest thing I've ever heard or the bravest.
Maybe both. She didn't speak. She just nodded. Then she lay down beside Emma, pulled her daughter close, and closed her eyes. Across the room, Elijah sat in his chair, his coffee gone cold, his hands still. Scout breathed slow and steady beside the cot, and somewhere outside, the wind carried the snow across a land that didn't care about the people on it. But inside this cabin, 3 broken people and an old dog had made it through another night. And sometimes, that was everything. Emma woke the next morning asking for food. Not broth, not tea. Food. Real food. She sat up in the cot, with Scout's head still resting on her lap, and looked at Clara with eyes that were clear for the first time in days, and said, "Mama, I'm hungry." Clara almost broke right there. She pressed her hand to Emma's forehead, warm but not burning. Not the terrifying furnace heat that had nearly taken her daughter from her. Just warm, like a child who'd been sleeping under heavy blankets. "You're hungry," Clara repeated, and the laugh that came out of her was wet and ragged and real. "Real hungry," Emma said. She looked down at Scout. "Is he hungry too?" Elijah was already at the stove. He hadn't said a word, but Clara saw the way he moved, faster than usual, his hands reaching for the cornmeal, the salt, the skillet, and she understood. He'd heard. And he was relieved in the way that men like him showed relief, not with words, with action. "Scout eats when I eat," Elijah said over his shoulder, "and I eat when the food's ready. So hold on." Emma looked at Clara. "He talks funny." Clara bit her lip to keep from smiling. "He talks just fine. He talks like Papa did." Clara's smile faded, not because it hurt, though it did, but because Emma hadn't mentioned Samuel in days. The child had been so consumed by fever and fear that her father had slipped somewhere behind the immediate business of survival. Now, he was back. And Clara didn't know if that was healing or heartbreak. "Your papa was a good talker," Clara said softly. "The best," Emma agreed. Then she looked at Elijah's back and whispered, "Mama, does he have any jam?" Elijah turned around. "I heard that." Emma's eyes went wide. "And yeah," Elijah said, "I got jam. Huckleberry. Made it last summer. But you gotta eat the cornbread first." "What if I eat half the cornbread first?" Elijah looked at Clara. Clara looked at Elijah. Something passed between them. Not amusement, exactly, but something close to it. The kind of moment that sneaks up on people who haven't had a reason to smile in too long. "Half," Elijah said, "but a real half, not a baby half." "I'm not a baby," Emma said. "Then eat like you ain't one." Emma pulled herself up straighter in the cot. She stuck her chin out in a way that was so purely Clara that Elijah had to look away. They ate together, not at the table. Emma wasn't strong enough to sit in a chair yet. But Elijah brought the food to the cot, and Clara sat beside her daughter, and they ate cornbread with huckleberry jam while Scout watched every bite with the patient intensity of a dog who has perfected the art of silent begging. Emma gave him a piece when she thought nobody was looking. Elijah saw. He didn't say anything. Clara saw too. She didn't say anything either. After breakfast, Emma fell asleep again, the way sick children do. Suddenly, completely, mid-sentence. One moment, she was telling Scout about the rabbit her papa had carved, and the next, she was gone, her small body curled against the dog, her breathing slow and even. Clara pulled the blanket up over her daughter's shoulders and stood. Elijah was at the table, cleaning the skillet. "She's better," Clara said. "She is. She talked more this morning than she has in a week." Elijah nodded. "Kids bounce back, faster than grown folks most times."
Clara sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table and looked at them. Her knuckles were still raw from pounding on Walter's door. The skin had scabbed over, but hadn't healed. She wondered if it ever would. "I need to tell you something," she said. Elijah set down the skillet. He sat. He waited. "My husband died 4 months ago. Pneumonia. He got sick in September and was gone by October. We lived on his family's farm, the Dawson place, about 20 miles southeast of here." Clara paused. "When Samuel was alive, his family tolerated me. I was useful. I cooked, cleaned, worked the land. But after he died, I became a problem. An extra mouth, a woman with no claim." "You were his wife." "I was his widow. There's a difference, apparently." Elijah's jaw tightened. Walter, that's Samuel's brother, he'd been wanting us gone from the day Samuel's heart stopped beating. He just waited until winter set in, so deep that I'd have nowhere to go. Clara's voice was steady. She'd practiced this steadiness. It was the only thing keeping her together. 3 days ago, he grabbed me by the arm and shoved me out the front door. My daughter was running a fever, and he didn't even let me take her coat. Elijah was very still. "He put his hands on you." "He did." "And the child." "Emma was in my arms when he pushed me. She hit the porch railing." Clara swallowed. "I asked for one thing. Emma's coat. It was hanging right there on the hook behind him. He could see it." He shut the door anyway. Elijah didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was low and even in a way that Clara recognized. It was the voice of a man holding something dangerous very carefully. "What's his full name?" "Walter Dawson." "But, Elijah, I didn't tell you this so you'd—" "I'm not going to do anything." He met her eyes. "I'm asking because if a man like that is 20 miles from here, I want to know his name." Clara studied him. She believed him. Not because his words were reassuring, but because his eyes were honest. He wasn't making promises he couldn't keep. He was taking inventory. "There's more," Clara said. "Walter wants the land. All of it. Samuel left a will, handwritten but legal, that gave me and Emma a share of the homestead. Walter told me the will was lost, that it burned in the stove. But I don't believe him." "You think he destroyed it?" "I think he's been planning this since the funeral." Elijah leaned back in his chair. He rubbed his hand across his jaw, the way men do when they're thinking through something that doesn't have an easy answer. "A handwritten will," he said. "If it was witnessed, it holds, even out here." "It was witnessed by the pastor in Ridgewood, Pastor Thomas Hargrove." Clara's heart beat faster. She hadn't said this out loud before, hadn't dared to. "If that will still exists, if Walter didn't destroy it, then Emma has a legal right to that land." "And Walter knows that." "Walter knows everything. That's why he threw me out in a blizzard with a sick child. He wasn't just getting rid of me, Elijah. He was trying to make sure I never came back." The words hung between them. Elijah looked at Clara with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not pity, not anger. Something harder. Something that looked like resolve. "Ridgewood," he said. "How far?" "About 15 miles east from here." "I know the town. Know the pastor, too. Hargrove's a decent man." Clara's breath quickened. "You know him?" "He came out this way once, few years back, after Ruth and Daniel." Elijah paused. "He's the one who made sure the graves had markers, carved the names himself." Clara felt something shift inside her. The world she'd been surviving in, cold, hostile, full of people like Walter, suddenly had threads connecting it. Small threads, fragile ones, but threads all the same. "There's a woman in Ridgewood, too," Elijah said. "Hattie Brennan. She's the one who buried Ruth and Daniel. She knows herbs, Medicine. Folks around here call her when the real doctor's too far or too drunk to come. He looked toward Emma. If anyone can tell us whether that fever's truly gone or just resting, it's Hattie. Can we get to her? Not today. Roads are still buried. But if the weather holds, I can ride out tomorrow. It's a hard day's ride, but I've done it in worse. Clara shook her head. I'm not letting you ride 15 miles through snow for us. You've already done too much. Elijah looked at her the way he had that first night. Direct, unhurried. Clara, your daughter just fought off a fever that could have killed her. You walked 20 miles through a blizzard with no food and no coat. You fought wolves with a kitchen knife. He paused. You don't get to tell me what's too much. Clara opened her mouth, closed it. She didn't have an argument for that. I'll leave at first light, Elijah said. I'll talk to Hattie, and while I'm there, I'll see Hargrove about that will. Elijah, you don't have to get involved in my... I'm already involved. He said it quietly, without drama, like stating the weather. A man threw a woman and a sick child into a storm. That child nearly died in my cabin. I'm involved. Clara looked at him. This man who had lost his own wife and son, who had built walls around himself so thick he'd lived alone for 4 years with nobody but an old dog. And now, without hesitation, he was walking straight into someone else's fight. Why? Clara asked. The same question she'd asked last night, but different now. Deeper. Elijah picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. Because Ruth would have wanted me to. Clara felt those words settle into her chest, like a stone dropped into deep water. She didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would match what he'd just given her. That afternoon, Emma woke again. Stronger this time. She sat up on her own, ate more cornbread, and spent 20 minutes talking to Scout about the various merits of different animals. Scout listened with the devoted attention of a dog who understood every word, or, at the very least, appreciated the company. Mama, did you know dogs can smell things from really far away? Emma said. I did know that. Did you know they can smell feelings? Clara raised an eyebrow. Where'd you hear that? Emma pointed at Elijah. He told me. Clara looked at Elijah, who was sitting by the fire sharpening his knife with a focus that was suddenly very intense. Did he now? Clara said. He said Scout knew I was sick because he could smell that I was sad inside, Emma continued. And that's why he stayed next to me, because dogs don't like when people are sad inside. Clara watched Elijah. His ears were red. Whether from the fire or from being caught telling a 5-year-old about the emotional intelligence of dogs, Clara couldn't tell. That true, Elijah? Clara asked. Elijah kept his eyes on the knife. More or less. More or less, Clara repeated. She felt something warm in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was small and unexpected, like the first green shoot pushing through snow. Mama, Emma said, can Scout sleep with me again tonight? That's up to Elijah, sweetheart. Elijah glanced at Scout. The dog had already settled himself beside the cot, chin on paws, as if the question had been answered hours ago. I think he's already decided, Elijah said. Emma beamed. It was the first real smile Clara had seen on her daughter's face since Samuel died. And it was directed not at Clara, not at the memory of her father, but at this quiet stranger and his old dog. Clara turned away so nobody would see her eyes. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep with Scout curled against her, and the cabin had settled into its nighttime quiet, Clara and Elijah sat at the table again. It was becoming a habit. The kind of habit that happens without either person deciding it. Just two people who find themselves drawn to the same place at the same time, because the alternative is being alone with their thoughts, and their thoughts are too heavy to carry by themselves. I need to ask you something, Clara said, and I need you to be honest. I'm always honest, It's one of my problems. When you ride to Ridgewood tomorrow, what happens if Walter's already been there? Elijah's expression didn't change. Then I'll know. That's not what I mean. What if he's told people things about me? What if he's already poisoned the town against us? Ridgewood ain't a big place, Clara. People talk. But Hargrove knows the difference between gossip and truth. And Hattie Brennan doesn't care what anybody says about anybody. She makes up her own mind. And if Walter comes here, while you're gone? Elijah was quiet for a moment. He looked toward the door, then at the rifle leaning against the wall. You know how to shoot? He asked. Samuel taught me. Then I'll leave the Winchester. It's loaded. 5 rounds. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me or Hattie, you put them on the ground. Clara stared at him. You'd leave me your rifle? I've got a pistol. I'll be fine. That's not what I... Clara stopped. She pressed her hands flat on the table. You barely know me, Elijah. You met me 2 days ago, and you're leaving me alone in your home with your gun and your dog? Elijah looked at her steadily. I know you carried your daughter through a blizzard. I know you stood between her and a wolf pack with a dull knife. I know you stayed up all night fighting a fever that could have taken her. He paused. I know enough. Clara felt her throat tighten. She had spent months being told she wasn't enough. Not enough to keep, not enough to shelter, not enough to hand a child's coat to through a closing door. And now this man, this quiet, broken, stubborn man, was handing her his rifle and his trust, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Elijah Cole, she said slowly, you are the strangest man I have ever met. I've been told. It wasn't a complaint. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Elijah didn't seem like a man who smiled easily. But a softening, a crack in the wall, just enough to let the light through. Get some sleep, he said. I'll be gone before dawn. I'll be back by nightfall, maybe sooner if the roads cooperate. Clara stood. She hesitated beside the table. She wanted to say something, something that matched the size of what he was doing for her. But the words felt too small. Everything she could think of felt too small. So instead, she said, Come back safe. Elijah nodded. Plan to. Clara walked to the cot and lay down beside Emma. She pulled her daughter close, feeling the steady rise and fall of the child's breathing. The warmth of Scout pressed against them both. She closed her eyes. But before sleep came, she heard Elijah moving quietly around the cabin, checking the fire, checking the door, loading the pistol. The sounds of a man preparing to ride into uncertain territory for people he had no obligation to protect. Clara listened to those sounds, and she thought about Walter, about the way he'd shoved her through that door without flinching, about the will he'd probably burned, about the way he'd looked at Emma like she was a stray that had wandered onto his property. And then she thought about Elijah, about the way he'd walked into a blizzard because wolves don't howl like that unless they've cornered someone. About the way he'd held Emma's head and whispered, "Good girl," while feeding her bitter tea. About the way he'd said Ruth's name like it was a wound that would never close, but that he carried anyway, because putting it down would mean forgetting, and forgetting was worse than hurting. 2 men. 2 brothers of a kind that blood had nothing to do with. One had thrown her into the cold. The other had pulled her out. Clara pressed her face against Emma's hair and breathed in the smell of her daughter. Warm skin, huckleberry jam, wood smoke. She tightened her arms around the child she had almost lost. "We're gonna be okay, baby," she whispered. "I don't know how yet, but we're gonna be okay." Scout sighed in his sleep. Emma's fingers twitched against Clara's hand, and outside, in the darkness, The wind carried the sound of a man saddling a horse in a barn he hadn't opened in months, because tomorrow he was riding to town for the first time in 4 years. Not for himself, for them. Elijah had been gone for 6 hours when the horse came. Clara heard it before she saw it. The heavy crunch of hooves breaking through snow crust, the snort of an animal pushed hard in cold weather. She was sitting by the fire, mending the tear in Emma's dress, when Scout lifted his head. The old dog's ears went flat. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Clara set down the needle. She looked at Scout. In 2 days, she had never heard him make that sound. "Mama?" Emma sat up in the cot, clutching her wooden bird. "What's wrong with Scout?" "Shh, baby. Stay right there." Clara crossed the room and took the Winchester from where Elijah had left it leaning against the wall. She checked the chamber the way Samuel had taught her. 5 rounds. She moved to the window and looked out. A single rider, coming up the trail from the southeast. Clara's stomach dropped. She knew that horse. A dark bay gelding with a white blaze on its forehead. She'd fed that horse carrots every morning for 6 years. It was Walter's horse. "Emma," Clara said. Her voice was calm, controlled. Every muscle in her body was screaming, but her voice was calm. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to take Scout and go to the back corner of the cabin, behind the woodpile. Can you do that?" Emma's eyes were wide. "Mama, you're scaring me." "I know, baby, but I need you to be brave. Can you be brave for Mama?" Emma nodded. She slid off the cot and wrapped her arms around Scout's neck. The old dog stood and moved with her, positioning himself between the child and the door without being told. Clara watched them go. Then she turned back to the window. Walter Dawson dismounted. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the smoke coming from the chimney. Then he walked toward the door with the same deliberate stride he'd used the night he'd thrown her out. Clara's hands tightened on the rifle. The knock came, 3 hard raps. Clara didn't answer. "Clara!" Walter's voice came through the door, muffled by wood and wind. "I know you're in there. I tracked you from the ridge. Open the door." Clara raised the Winchester to her shoulder. "The door stays shut, Walter." Silence. Then a laugh, short, humorless. "You gonna shoot me through a door? That what you've come to?" "I'll shoot you through whatever I need to. You're not welcome here." "This ain't even your place. Whose cabin is this?" "None of your concern." "It is my concern when my brother's widow is shacked up with some stranger in the middle of nowhere with my niece." Clara felt the words land like a slap. She steadied the rifle. "Emma is my daughter, not your niece. You made that real clear when you threw us out to die." "I didn't throw you out to die. I told you to go to Ridgewood." "In a blizzard, with no horse, no food, no coat, and a child running 104 fever. Clara's voice shook. She hated that it shook. "You didn't send us to Ridgewood, Walter. You sent us to a grave." Quiet on the other side of the door. Then Walter spoke, and his voice had changed. Softer now. Reasonable. The voice he used when he wanted something. "Clara, listen to me. I made a mistake. I know that. Edna's been after me about it every day since you left. She can't sleep. She can't eat. She's worried sick about Emma." "Edna had her chance to worry. She walked upstairs." "She's a woman under her husband's roof. She didn't have a choice." "She had a choice. She chose you." Walter was quiet again. Clara could hear him breathing on the other side of the door. She could picture him, standing there, hat in hand, working through his options the way he always did. Walter Dawson never did anything without calculating the angles first. "Clara, I came here to bring you home." That stopped being my home when you bolted the door behind me. The farm is Emma's birthright. Samuel would have wanted— Don't. Clara's voice cut like a blade. Don't you dare say his name to me. Not after what you did. I'm saying it because it's true. That land belongs to the Dawson family. Emma is a Dawson. She deserves to grow up on that land. She deserves to grow up alive, which she almost didn't, thanks to you. Clara heard Emma whimper behind her. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. If she took her eyes off that door, if she let her guard down for 1 second, Walter would find the crack and push through it. That's what he did. That's what he'd always done. Open the door, Clara. Let me see my niece. Let me see that she's okay. Then we'll talk. We're done talking. If you don't open this door, I'll open it myself. Clara pulled the hammer back on the Winchester. The click was loud enough to carry through the wood. Try it, she said. Silence. A long silence. The kind that stretches and stretches until the air itself feels like it's holding its breath. Then Walter spoke, and all the softness was gone. You think some stranger with a rifle is going to protect you? You think hiding out here in the woods changes anything? That land is mine, Clara. The will is gone. There's no proof Samuel left you anything. And when spring comes, I'll file the claim, and there won't be a damn thing you can do about it. The will was witnessed. Clara heard it. The smallest pause. A hitch in Walter's breathing that lasted less than a second, but told her everything. What? Walter said. Pastor Hargrove witnessed that will. He saw Samuel sign it. He knows what's in it. Clara pressed her advantage. You can burn the paper, Walter, but you can't burn a man's memory. Walter didn't respond. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. This time Clara could feel him recalculating, adjusting, figuring out his next move. Hargrove's an old man, Walter said finally. Old men forget things. Not things like this. And even if he remembers, it's his word against mine. A preacher and a widow against a landowner. Who do you think the territorial judge is going to believe? I think he's going to believe the truth. Walter laughed. It was an ugly sound. Truth. You always were naive, Clara. Samuel loved that about you. I never understood it. Clara felt something shift inside her. Not anger. She'd been angry for days. Something harder. Something colder. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop being afraid of the person who's been hurting you. Walter, she said, I'm going to say this once. You're going to get on your horse. You're going to ride back to that farm, and you're going to wait. Because when the snow clears, I'm coming for what belongs to my daughter. Every acre, every fence post, every stone. You can't. I just survived a blizzard, a wolf pack, and my daughter nearly dying in my arms. You really think you scare me? The silence that followed was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard. Then she heard Walter step back from the door. 1 step. 2. His boots crunching in the snow. This isn't over, he said. No, Clara agreed. It's not. She listened to him walk to his horse, listened to the leather creak as he mounted, listened to the hooves break through the snow as he rode away. She didn't lower the rifle until the sound had faded completely, swallowed by the wind and the distance and the vast white emptiness of Montana. Then her legs gave out. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, the rifle across her knees. Her hands were shaking so hard, the barrel rattled against the wooden stock. Mama! Emma was beside her. When had she moved? The child's small hands were on Clara's face, patting her cheeks, her eyes enormous with worry. Mama, are you crying? Clara hadn't realized she was.
She wiped her face with the back of her hand and pulled Emma against her. "I'm okay, baby. I'm okay." "Was that Uncle Walter?" "Yes." "Is he gone?" "He's gone." Emma pressed her face into Clara's neck. "I don't like him, Mama." "I know, sweetheart." "He's mean." "He is." "Is he coming back?" Clara closed her eyes. She wanted to say no. She wanted to promise her daughter that Walter Dawson would never darken their door again. But she was done lying, done pretending the world was safer than it was. "I don't know," Clara said, "but I'll be here if he does, and so will Elijah, and Scout." Emma pulled back and looked at her mother. "Elijah won't let him hurt us." Clara stared at her daughter. This child who 3 days ago had been too afraid to look at Elijah, who had hidden behind Clara's arm and whispered, "He's big," like it was a warning. Now she said his name like it meant safety. "No," Clara said quietly. "He won't." Scout padded over and pushed his nose against Emma's hand. The child wrapped her arms around the dog's neck and held on. Clara sat there on the floor of a stranger's cabin, holding a rifle she'd never expected to need. Her daughter pressed against her, and she felt two things at once. Fear, because Walter would come back. He always came back. And strength, because this time she wouldn't be alone when he did. Elijah returned at dusk. Clara heard the horse before she saw him, but this time Scout's ears went up, not flat. His tail moved. He knew the difference. Clara opened the door. Elijah dismounted, his face red from the cold, snow dusting his shoulders. He looked at her, looked at the rifle still in her hand, and his expression changed. What happened? Walter was here. Elijah went still. His hand dropped to the pistol on his hip. When? This afternoon, about 6 hours after you left. Did he touch you? He didn't get through the door. Elijah's eyes moved over her face, reading it. But he tried. He knocked, he talked, he threatened. I held the rifle and told him to leave. Clara paused. He left. Elijah exhaled. Some of the tension left his shoulders, but not all of it. Not nearly all of it. He tracked you here. He said he followed our trail from the ridge. Then he knows where this cabin is. He can come back any time. I know. Elijah led the horse toward the small barn behind the cabin. Clara followed him. The cold bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. What did you find in Ridgewood? She asked. Elijah pulled the saddle off the horse and set it on the rail. His movements were controlled, deliberate, the way they always were when he was thinking through something. Hargrove's alive, sharp as ever. He remembers the will. Clara's heart lurched. He does? Every word. Samuel came to him in August, 2 weeks before he got sick, wrote the whole thing out at Hargrove's kitchen table, left half the land to you and Emma, the other half to Walter, on the condition that Walter provided for you both if anything happened to Samuel. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth. Walter was supposed to take care of us. That was in the will. That's what Hargrove says. And here's the thing. Hargrove didn't just witness the will. He copied it, made a second version in his own hand, and locked it in the church safe. Clara grabbed Elijah's arm. There's a copy? Sitting in a strongbox under the altar of Ridgewood Baptist Church. Clara's knees went weak. She leaned against the barn wall, her breath coming fast. Walter doesn't know. Walter has no idea. He thought burning the original was enough. Clara laughed. It came out sharp and wild, and nothing like humor. But it was the best sound she'd made in months. That arrogant, stupid, heartless... There's more. Clara looked at him. Havie Brennan.
I talked to her about Emma, told her about the fever, the symptoms, how it spiked and broke. Elijah paused. She wants to come out here, check on Emma herself. She said a fever like that can come back if it ain't treated right, and she's got medicine that'll make sure it doesn't. When? She'll ride out with me day after tomorrow, weather permitting. She's tough enough to handle the trail. And the will? When can we? Hargrove said he'll testify. Before a judge, before a territorial court, before God himself, if that's what it takes. His words. Elijah looked at her. Clara, you've got a case. A real one. Walter violated the terms of Samuel's will. He was supposed to provide for you. Instead, he threw you out. A judge will see that. Clara felt something rising in her chest. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the night Walter had locked that door. It was hot and fierce and terrifying in its intensity. Hope. Real hope. Not the desperate, fragile kind she'd been clinging to. The kind with teeth. Elijah, she said, I can get Emma's land back. You can get your land back, Elijah corrected. Samuel left it to both of you. Clara looked at him. This man who had ridden 15 miles through snow to a town he hadn't visited in 4 years, who had spoken to people he'd spent 4 years avoiding, who had done all of it without being asked, without expecting anything, without hesitation. You rode to Ridgewood for the first time in 4 years, Clara said. Elijah busied himself with the horse's bridle. I did. For us. Don't make it bigger than it is. It is big, Elijah. Hattie buried your wife and son. Hargrove carved their markers. Going back there, facing those people, that place, that wasn't nothing. Elijah's hands stopped on the bridle. He stood very still, his back to her. How was it? Clara asked softly. Being there? He didn't answer for a long time. The horse shifted, stamping one hoof against the frozen ground. Hard, Elijah said finally. Walking into that church, seeing Hargrove, he looked at me like... He stopped, swallowed. Like he'd been waiting for me to come back. Maybe he was. Elijah turned around. His eyes were bright in a way Clara hadn't seen before. Not with tears. Elijah wasn't the kind of man who let tears fall. But with something behind them. Something pressing against the wall he'd built. Testing it. Hattie hugged me, he said. Just grabbed me soon as I walked through her door. Didn't say a word, just held on. He shook his head. I didn't know what to do with that. Clara stepped closer. You let her? Didn't have much choice. Woman's got a grip like a blacksmith. Clara almost smiled. Elijah. Yeah. Thank you for what you did today, for all of it. He looked at her. The barn was cold. The horse was steaming. The last light was fading from the sky. And Elijah Cole looked at Clara Dawson the way a man looks at something he thought he'd never see again. Ruth would have liked you, he said. Clara felt those words move through her like warm water. She didn't know what to say, so she said the truest thing she had. I wish I'd known her. Elijah nodded. He picked up the saddle and carried it inside the barn. Clara watched him go, and she stood there in the cold for a moment longer, letting the weight of everything settle. Walter knew where they were. He would come back. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time, Clara had something she hadn't had before. She had proof. She had allies. She had a man who would ride through a blizzard and face his own ghosts to give her a chance. And she had herself. Clara Dawson, who had been told she was nothing, who had been thrown out like garbage, who had walked 20 miles through a storm with a dying child in her arms. She walked back into the cabin. Emma was on the floor, cross-legged, feeding Scout pieces of cornbread. The fire was burning. The room was warm. "Mama!" Emma looked up. "Elijah's back?" "He's back." "Did he bring medicine for me?" "A lady named Hattie is coming to see you in 2 days. She's going to make sure you're all better." Emma considered this. "Is she nice?" Clara thought about what Elijah had said. A woman who hugged a broken man without saying a word. A woman who had buried 2 strangers and carved markers for their graves. A woman who was willing to ride through snow to check on a child she'd never met. "I think she might be the nicest person in Montana," Clara said. Emma smiled. "Nicer than Elijah?" Clara heard the cabin door open behind her. Elijah stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "Nobody's nicer than Elijah," Clara said quietly. She hadn't meant for him to hear it, but the way his boots paused mid-stamp told her he had. Emma went back to feeding Scout. Elijah went to the stove. Clara went to the table and sat down. Nobody spoke, but the cabin felt full in a way it hadn't before. Full of the things they were all too careful to say out loud, but that lived in the spaces between them. In the cornbread shared with an old dog, in the coffee poured without asking, in the rifle leaned against the wall within reach. Clara looked at Emma, looked at Elijah, looked at Scout. 4 months ago, she'd had a husband, a home, and a life she understood. Then she'd lost all of it, every single piece. But sitting here now, in this cabin that wasn't hers, with a man she'd known for 3 days and a dog who had decided her daughter belonged to him, Clara realized something she hadn't expected. She wasn't rebuilding what she'd lost. She was building something new. Hattie Brennan arrived on the back of a mule that looked almost as old as she did, carrying a leather bag stuffed with herbs, tinctures, and opinions she had no intention of keeping to herself. Clara heard her before she saw her. A voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the morning cold like a bell. "Elijah Cole, if you don't come help me off this animal, I swear on every saint I know, I'll fall into this snow and blame you for the rest of your natural life." Elijah was already moving. He reached the mule in 3 strides and offered his arm. Hattie grabbed it, swung herself down with surprising agility for a woman her age, and immediately smacked him on the chest with her free hand. 4 years, she said. 4 years without a word, not a letter, not a visit, nothing. And the first time I see your face, it's because you need something. Hattie, don't you Hattie me. I buried your wife. I buried your boy. I sat by those graves for 3 days, waiting for you to come home. And when you did, you looked at me like I was a stranger and rode off into the mountains. 4 years, Elijah. Elijah stood there and took it, every word. He didn't flinch, didn't deflect, didn't look away. He just stood in the snow and let this woman say what she'd been carrying for 4 years. When she finished, her eyes were wet. She wiped them with the back of her glove and shook her head. "You look thin," she said. "I eat fine." "You look thin, and you look tired, and you look like a man who's been alone too long." She grabbed his face with both hands, the way a mother grabs a son. "But you're here, so I'll forgive you. Eventually." Clara watched from the doorway. She hadn't expected this. She'd expected a doctor, someone clinical, professional, detached. What she got was a force of nature in a wool coat who had just made Elijah Cole, the man who had faced down wolves and blizzards without blinking, stand perfectly still while she held his face and scolded him. Hattie looked past Elijah and saw Clara. Her expression shifted. The sharpness softened into something warm and assessing. "You must be Clara."
Yes, ma'am.
Hattie walked toward her, studying her the way a person studies a fence to see if it'll hold. She stopped in front of Clara, looked her up and down, and nodded once. "You're the one who walked 20 miles in a blizzard with a sick child."
I am.
"Good. Then you're tougher than you look. Where's my patient?" Clara led her inside. Emma was sitting on the cot with Scout beside her, watching the door with wide eyes. Hattie stopped when she saw the child. Something moved across her face, quick, deep, gone before Clara could name it.
"Well now,"
Hattie said softly. She set down her bag and knelt in front of the cot.
"You must be Emma."
Emma pressed closer to Scout.
"How do you know my name?"
"A very tall, very quiet man rode all the way to my house to tell me about you. Said you were the bravest girl he'd ever met." Emma looked past Hattie to Elijah, who was standing just inside the door.
"He said that?"
"He did." Emma looked back at Hattie.
"He doesn't talk much."
"No, he doesn't. But when he does, he means every word." Hattie held out her hand.
"Can I feel your forehead?"
Emma hesitated. She looked at Clara. Clara nodded. Emma leaned forward. Hattie pressed her palm to the child's forehead, then her cheeks, then the sides of her neck. She listened to Emma's breathing. She looked at her eyes, her tongue, her fingernails.
"Fever's gone,"
Hattie said,
"but it left its mark. She's weak, needs good food, rest, and this."
She pulled a small bottle from her bag.
3 drops in water, morning and night, for 2 weeks. It'll keep the fever from coming back."
Clara took the bottle. Her hands were trembling.
"Is she going to be all right? Really all right?"
Hattie looked at her. "She's going to be fine. Children are harder to kill than grown folks think. They bend where we break." She glanced at Scout. "And having a dog helps."
"He won't leave her side,"
Clara said. "Smart dog." Hattie straightened and turned to Clara with a different look on her face now. Serious. Direct. "Elijah told me about Walter." Clara stiffened.
"What did he say?"
"Everything. The farm, the will, the night he threw you out." Hattie's jaw tightened. "I've known men like Walter Dawson my whole life. They take what isn't theirs and convince themselves they deserve it."
"He's going to fight us," Clara said. "He was here 2 days ago. He knows where we are."
"Let him fight. He's got less ground than he thinks." Hattie reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. She held it up. "Hargrove gave me this to bring you." Clara took the envelope. Her fingers shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter, written in a careful, steady hand. She read it. Then she read it again.
"It's a sworn statement," Clara said. Her voice cracked. "Hargrove wrote out everything he remembers about Samuel's will. Every detail. The date, the witnesses, the terms. He signed it and stamped it with the church seal."
"He also wrote to Judge Callahan and Helena," Hattie said. "Sent the letter before I left. Explained the situation. Asked for a hearing." Clara looked at the letter in her hands. She looked at Hattie. She looked at Elijah, who stood by the door with his arms crossed, watching her quietly.
"Why?" Clara asked Hattie. "You don't know me. You've never met Emma. Why are you doing this?"
Hattie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because 30 years ago, my husband died and his brother tried to take my land. I had no one to fight for me. I lost everything." She looked at Elijah. "And because 4 years ago, I buried a woman and a boy who deserved better. I couldn't save them. But maybe I can help save you." Clara pressed the letter against her chest. She couldn't speak. The room blurred. Hattie put a hand on her shoulder. "Don't you cry yet. Crying is for when the fight's over. and this fight ain't over." Clara wiped her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Now feed me. I didn't ride 6 hours on a mule to stand here being emotional." They ate together, all of them, around the small table. Elijah pulled the cot closer so Emma could sit up and eat with them. Hattie talked enough for everyone, filling the cabin with stories about Ridgewood, about her mule, about the time she'd treated a man for snakebite and he'd tried to pay her with a live chicken. Emma laughed. Really laughed, open and free, the kind of laugh that fills a room. Clara watched her daughter's face and thought, this is what she's supposed to sound like. This is who she is when she's not afraid. Elijah didn't say much, but Clara noticed the way he listened, not just politely, deeply, like a man hearing music for the first time in years. After lunch, Hattie examined Emma again, gave Clara instructions for the medicine, and then stood by the door, pulling on her gloves. "I'll be back in a week to check on her," Hattie said. "And Clara, when the road's clear, you come to Ridgewood. You stay with me while we sort this legal business. I've got room. It ain't fancy, but it's warm, and the door stays open." Clara's throat tightened. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to. There's a difference." Hattie looked at Elijah. "And you? Don't you disappear on me again. I'm too old to chase you." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah said. Hattie hugged him. He stood stiff for a moment, then his arms came up and he held her back. Just for a second. But Clara saw it, and she saw the way Hattie's eyes closed, and she understood that this embrace was 4 years of silence being broken. Hattie pulled back, patted Elijah's cheek, and walked out the door. They watched her climb onto her mule and ride away, straight-backed and sure, until the trail swallowed her up. Emma waved from the window. "Bye, Hattie." A distant voice carried back through the cold. "Bye, sweetheart. Mind your mama." Clara turned to Elijah. He was still standing by the door, looking out at the empty trail. "You okay?" Clara asked. "Yeah." He shut the door. "She hasn't changed." "She loves you." Elijah didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Clara could see it in the way he stood there, one hand still on the door, like he was holding on to something he'd almost let go of, forever. That night, after Emma fell asleep with Scout, Clara and Elijah sat at the table. The fire was low. The cabin was quiet. The letter from Hargrove lay between them on the table like a promise written in ink. "I've been thinking," Clara said. "About what?" "About what happens next. When the snow clears. When the hearing happens." She paused. "When this is over." Elijah was carving again. A new piece, bigger than the bird he'd made for Emma. His knife moved slowly, deliberately. "What about it?" he said. "If the judge rules in my favor, I'll have the land back, half of it at least. Emma will have a home." Clara ran her finger along the edge of the table. "But that home is 20 miles from here." Elijah's knife paused, just for a heartbeat. Then it resumed. "I know," he said. "You've done more for us than anyone in my life. More than Walter, more than Edna, more than anyone in Samuel's family ever did." Clara swallowed. "And I've been trying to figure out how to say this without saying too much or too little." Elijah set down the knife. He set down the wood. He looked at her. "Then just say it," he said. Clara met his gaze. "I don't want to leave." The words sat between them, honest and bare. Elijah didn't move. He didn't speak. He just looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that had seen too much loss and not enough hope. "I know it doesn't make sense," Clara continued. "I know we've only known each other for days. I know you came out here to be alone, and I showed up on your doorstep half dead with a sick child, and turned your whole world upside down. And I know you still love Ruth, and you probably always will. I'm not trying to replace her. I'm not trying to be something I'm not." She exhaled shakily. "But Emma sleeps through the night here. She laughs here. She talks to your dog like he's her best friend. And I feel safe here. For the first time since Samuel died, I feel like I can breathe." Elijah was very still. "So I'm asking you," Clara said, "not telling, asking. Is there room here? For us?" The silence stretched. The fire cracked. Scout shifted in his sleep. Then Elijah reached across the table, slowly, carefully, like a man reaching for something fragile. His hand covered hers. His fingers were rough and warm, and they curled around her own with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "Clara," he said, "I've been alone for 4 years. I built this cabin to disappear in. I came out here because I thought if I got far enough away from people, the hurt would stop." He paused. It didn't. Clara waited. Then you showed up, half frozen, half starved, holding a sick child and a kitchen knife. And you looked at me like you were ready to fight the whole world if you had to. Something shifted in his face, a crack in the wall. But this time, instead of sealing it shut, he let it stay. And I thought, there she is. There's the reason I didn't leave. Clara's breath caught. "Ruth would have loved Emma," Elijah said quietly. "She would have fought Walter herself. Probably would have won, too." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "And she would have told me. She would have said, 'Elijah Cole, if you let that woman walk out of your life, you're a bigger fool than I married.'" Clara laughed. It was wet and broken and real. "There's room," Elijah said. "There's always been room. I just didn't know who it was for until you walked through my door." Clara turned her hand beneath his, their fingers laced together. She held on, and he held on, and neither of them let go. "We'll figure out the land," Elijah said. "We'll face Walter. We'll go to the hearing. Whatever comes, we'll handle it." "Together?" Clara said. "Together." From the cot, a small voice rose in the darkness. "Mama?" Clara turned. Emma was sitting up, Scout beside her, the wooden bird clutched in one hand. "I heard you talking," Emma said sleepily. She rubbed her eyes and looked at Elijah. "Are we staying?" Clara looked at Elijah. Elijah looked at Clara. "Yeah, sweetheart," Clara said. "We're staying." Emma looked at Elijah. "Is that okay?" Elijah got up from the table. He crossed the room and knelt beside the cot, bringing himself down to Emma's level. Scout's tail thumped against the blanket. "Emma," he said, "you see that dog right there?" Emma nodded. "Scout's been with me for a long time. He's the best friend I've ever had. And from the day you walked in here, he hasn't left your side. Not once." Elijah reached out and scratched Scout behind the ear. "Now, I'm a pretty smart man, but I ain't smarter than my dog. If Scout says you belong here, then you belong here." Emma looked at Scout. Scout looked at Emma. Then the dog licked her face, and Emma giggled so hard she fell backward into the pillows. "He said yes," Emma declared. "He sure did," Elijah said. Emma reached out her small hand and grabbed Elijah's sleeve. She didn't pull. She just held on. And Elijah let her. Clara stood by the table, watching her daughter hold on to this man who had walked into a blizzard to save them, who had fought a fever through the night, who had ridden to a town he'd avoided for 4 years, who had faced his own grief and come back standing. And she thought about all the doors that had closed behind her. Walter's door, Samuel's grave. Every door that had ever slammed shut when she needed it most. But this door had opened. "Mama," Emma said, "come here." Clara crossed the room. She sat on the edge of the cot. Emma grabbed her hand with one small fist and Elijah's sleeve with the other, linking them together with the fierce, unshakable grip of a child who had decided, with the absolute certainty that only children possess, that these were her people. Scout barked once, short and sharp, as if to confirm. "Well," Clara said, "I guess that settles it." Elijah looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled. Not the half smiles, not the cracks in the wall, not the ghost of something that used to be. A real smile. Full and warm and so unexpected that Clara felt it in her chest like sunlight. "I guess it does," he said. The winter would not last forever. The snow would melt, the roads would clear, the hearing would come, and Clara would stand in the courtroom and fight for every acre that belonged to her daughter. Walter would rage and scheme and threaten, but he would lose, because he had built his case on a burned piece of paper, and Clara had built hers on the truth. Hattie Brennan would sit in the front row of that courtroom, arms crossed, daring anyone to challenge the woman she'd taken under her wing. Pastor Hargrove would take the stand and speak clearly, without hesitation, about the will he had witnessed and the copy he had kept safe for the day it would be needed. And Elijah Cole would be there, not speaking, not fighting, just standing beside Clara with the same quiet steadiness he'd carried since the night he'd walked into a storm, because wolves don't howl like that unless they've cornered someone. But all of that was ahead of them. All of that was for later. Tonight, there was just this. A cabin in the mountains. A fire that burned steady. An old dog who had chosen a little girl and refused to leave her. A man who had lost everything and found the courage to try again. A woman who had been thrown away and discovered she was worth more than anyone had ever told her. And a child who held them all together with two small hands and a heart big enough to believe that love could be found in the strangest places. Clara leaned against Elijah's shoulder. Emma curled between them, already drifting back to sleep. Scout pressed warm against her feet. "Elijah?" Clara whispered. "Yeah?" "We made it." He turned his head. His lips brushed her hair. "We did." Outside, the wind had gone still. The snow had stopped falling, and somewhere in the distance, a sparrow sang, small and steady and stubborn, the kind of bird that stays when everything else has fled. Clara closed her eyes. She was home.